Okay, welcome everybody to the Pipe Factory. You're sitting within a 10-year retrospective environmental art exhibition. None of the works that you're looking at were created for this exhibition. They all already existed. They were already commissioned. They've lasted over 10 years, and I use them as provocation tools. That's what they are used for. And I've set a timer. We're only going to go for 2 minutes on each slide. And this will basically set the context for why I work in this way. So for anyone new to the field, basically my work is situated within an ecological framework. There are quite a few quotes within the talk, but they're really vital because they underpin what we're talking about. So we're looking at ecology, so the relationship between organisms to one another and to their physical surroundings. These relationships, as Donna Haraway would talk about, are sticky. They are relational, they're political. So the way in which one or two or more people or things are connected, but they're political in terms of done or acting in the interests of status or power within an organisation rather than a matter of principle. So they're quite complex. Our ecological relationships to our surroundings and the processes that help us do what it is we do on a nation-state level each and every day are politically loaded. Almost always my work has originated out of waste. I'm particularly interested in both physical waste and emotional waste. I think we have a psychological connection that is missing, that has dropped out, that is a link that has been left behind between the rubbish that we create and the end of our own life cycles. So much of what I create is concerned with our rites of passage. Much of our understanding to do with mortality and death has been shelved off, has been insulated, has been placed somewhere else by a lot of the processes that surround us. So I'm interested in physical waste and emotional waste. And that brings me very naturally to found objects. Natural, man-made, a fragment of an object that is found, or sometimes bought by an artist and kept because some of the intrinsic interest in the artist sees in it. Oh, here's my timer. We're on it. So the root of this comes from my very early works, and I really want to talk you through that because there is a... Oh, is that the timer still going? Maybe. I'll keep talking. So the root of the practice that you're surrounded by with these works comes from large-scale multiple waste installations. And this is what I began with when I first started out. This is my graduation show on the right-hand side. When I was a student, I worked in Borders, which at the time was Europe's largest, I was in Europe's largest single-story bookshop. So that was the birth of me being at the centre of a supply chain that was basically bringing in posters, marketing, vinyls that would come in multiple times a week, would be thrown up onto the glass windows, would then be thrown away into the skips out of the back of that place. I was a student, I was thinking, so this is a flow of material that is exactly the same as any oil paint or any mark of charcoal on a piece of paper. I could see this avalanche of marketing materials coming towards me. And that's where I began to work with waste objects. The image on the left-hand side, particularly interesting. Borders went bust, and when the company went bust, all of that marketing materials, all of them that were left, they were just thrown into the large-scale skips that you can walk into. And I turned up, I was no longer working in the company at that time, but they knew that I had a particular fascination with waste and waste products, and they said to me, Robyn, we've got lots of stuff if you want it, lots of stuff. You know, these potent, symbolic objects that represent who it is we are as human beings, that would be representative of a token when we purchase something. It's a bag, and yet it advertises the company. And I walked into this huge walk-in skip, and there were tens of thousands of plastic bags. And at the time, in 2011, 45,000 plastic bags were the number of bags you would have used in your lifetime. Now, I can almost hear the questions forming in your head where it's like, Robyn, you're really interested in waste, but why are you attracting so much waste, and what do you do with it afterwards? Because what's super important for me with my practice is if I'm talking to you and I'm creating installation spaces out of these products, and these items that have been thrown away by the system, is that I know where they're going afterwards. So the provenance of the item to begin with and the supply chain and where it goes to is just as important as the exhibition in the first place. So in a way, you're sat within sort of a fascinating I'm not saying the show's fascinating, that's for you to say, but you're sat within an interesting dialogue because these are rare objects in relationship to what it is I normally produce. So much of the much of the work, the items, the installations goes right back into the supply chain. So all of these things were recycled afterwards, and it's the image that becomes the document. Occasionally, we have these objects, and when I make these objects, which is less than 25% of the time in terms of my practice, these will always come back into different settings, different contexts. They'll go into schools, they'll be used as a provocation tool, and I hope to take these items with me until the day that I die, because my point about it is what lasts and what is lasting. You know, in a rapacious system where we're producing new objects all the time, these need to come back in because they're a reflexive tool. That it's not just that we're going to see it here today and then it's gone, and it doesn't matter how long that lasts. We need to keep asking these questions. So I've had the thumbs up because I'm probably doubled up on that slide. Okay. If we extend out this conversation surrounding waste and we look at the wider understanding of where waste sits within our cultural cycle, I became part of a residency programme in Istanbul. So when Liverpool became capital of culture, there were 7 of us as women, and we set ourselves up as an organisation, a group of women that would exchange with women in other capitals of culture, because we were really fascinated in sustainability and what would come from capital of culture status. You know, there are many objects that are created again and many commissions that come from those processes. But we wanted to step back and go and talk to other artists and other practitioners that had been working with the capital of culture status. So over the course of quite a few years, we visited Istanbul, we went to Linz in Austria, and the work that I created focused very much on the waste pickers in Istanbul. Really fascinating, necessary, and not often seen on the streets in the way in which we would understand it here, but people setting up informal collections of their waste. I mean, even down to this gentleman's collection, which was next to a really expensive, very well-funded bank, but it was understood that this was the place that he went to all of the bins to find the plastic, to find the cars, and to truly value that waste stream, because in his framework of his living, he could see value in that in a way in which you can rarely see now on our streets and in terms of the way in which we interact with these materials. Okay. If we dig into the root of where I feel that many of us are at now in terms of our reactions or our lack of reaction or our inability to respond fully to the way the avalanche of information that we're finding, we're placed within, and these are words that are really coming to the forefront in our understanding: eco-anxiety, eco-grief, climate trauma. Anxiety, the avoidance of a stressful situation, and an autonomic arousal, so sweaty palms, breathing faster, feeling panic or alarm. It's completely and utterly natural within the environmental crisis that we find ourselves in that we would feel anxiety. So the psychological mechanisms of denial and avoidance as a socially constructed narrative that promotes a psychological distance. So even if we just consider this for a moment, and often I hear people saying, why aren't we doing anything? Why aren't we doing enough? And it's because, you know, on a very basic psychological level, we are quite often like a rabbit in the headlights with truly horrific information, you know, cascading towards us. And much of the time we're stuck within this place of denial and avoidance, or it's too large for me, I feel too disempowered by it, it's too large a narrative. Jem Bendel talks about deep adaptation, and he talks about climate tragedies, but he talks of preparing, not just practically, but emotionally. And this is one of the really important things that I feel underpins what it is I want to share with you today. And it's one of the reasons sometimes I get frustrated when we pivot on the, do you recycle your bottles or not? We're in a really vitally important time where we have to prepare emotionally. We have to prepare emotionally collectively, and we have to prepare emotionally individually, and we have to go straight to the point of grief, because we're within a context of ecological grief. So the focus of starting to begin to really understand where our grief sits in terms of these materials, in terms of these processes, in terms of the way in which we interact with the earth, goes straight to the point of our eco-grief and understanding of where we place grief within our cultural and societal narratives. Hello, everyone that's just come in. So I'll tell you a little bit of background on the neon sign that we're looking at, and it just, again, gives you a context of where some of these overlaps began to occur. So I was given access to these knives and forks. These knives and forks are from Walmart, so they're from the Asda supply chain. And they were rejected by the supply chain because the colours didn't match. The knife and the fork didn't match. So basically I always said, they said, look, you can have as many of these as you want. They've been rejected by the chain. Here we are, we're going to gift them to you. And over the course of probably 2-3 years, I ended up creating a couple of different installations, but this is the first manifestation of them. And I'll never forget a child walking into this installation last, which is where this sign comes from 2012. And he stepped into this tower. This is a tower at Metal at Edge Hill Railway Station in Liverpool. And you could only enter that space, which is literally about as far as me to the people on the front row. That's about the square of that space. So I filled it with this tree where the canopy and the light of the canopy hit the light of that tree. So the light as you came in, you could see this plastic, kind of indistinct, semi-vile, but also really beautiful flooring. And a child said to me, oh, it's just like evil snow. It's just like evil snow, and went straight in and was jumping with like amazing joy on this unbelievable excess that is, this is, for me, symptomatic. It's the cheapest. I wish I had one here to show you, but this is not far off. I mean, it's a big biro, isn't it? The cheapest possible denominator in the supply chain for the cheapest possible price, where you might be paying, especially these are Asda, Walmart knives and forks, they might have been 0.02 pence in value. And you're standing on tens of thousands of them within a system that isn't fully capable of recycling it, where people will go on a hot sunny day and get their cheap knives and forks, use them for a couple of minutes, throw it in a bin, when in reality, when we're talking about what lasts and what's lasting, so this regenerative tool of the neon sign, this plastic should be £200, £300, £400. This plastic has the capability to outlive all of us. So that may still be here in 500 years. That may be here in 1,000 years. If that's going to be here in 1,000 years, where are we in this psychological map of thinking, I'm just going to pay 49p for 6 or 12 or 28 knives and forks? And let's think for a second about the system that is based on profit and profit margins. Where does that lie within its system of meaning that it thinks it's okay because it's about value for the shareholders to sell this for 49p or 29p? Getting the thumbs up to click on again. I get very passionate about plastic. The reason I get passionate about plastic, and it goes back to our earliest roots, is that my father was a plastic moulding salesman. So from my youngest days, the back of his 1970s Volvo that he was given as his company car were filled with cardboard boxes full of plastic mouldings. And from a very young, early age, I feel like I went on an intergalactic journey with him where, of course, he was in awe of this material. And from a very early age, it just began to really bed in for me. Okay. I'm fascinated by a system of meaning that allows us to understand. Some of you may know about Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, but use this term rhizome or rhizomatic. So to describe theory and research that allows us for multiple non-hierarchical entry and exit points in data representation and interpretation. So when I create an environmental process banner and I then put it into a context it would never normally be within, whether that is in a big corporate company or it's on the side of a building where you'd never see something of that nature, or if it's a neon sign that goes into the train station, which is where Stephenson's rocket first was tested, so one of the oldest railway stations in the world. When we bring these objects of activation in, it's rhizomatic in terms of our meaning. We're entering a system of complex and sometimes simple, non-hierarchical entry and exit points. So I'm going to keep going. More thumbs up. I will be available for questions at the end. So the pivot between working with these waste objects and these multiple large environments and taking responsibility for how they are placed, how they're located, and what I do with them afterwards, came in 2009. So my mother died unexpectedly in 2009. And there's a practitioner that talks, called Mustakis, who talks about indwelling. And I was 33 when she died, and it was completely blindsided me. Total rite of passage, totally unexpected. We were very close, and the pivot was just unbelievable. So when Mustakis talks about indwelling, so being in the centre of the narrative of that journey, you know, I remember somebody talking to me about plastic waste and thinking, I can't look at anything around plastic waste any longer. I can only look at the story of where the matrilineal line has ended and severed at a point that I hadn't expected. And this is the root of everything that has come from it in terms of practice. And how I want to talk to you about eco-grief and climate anxiety. Because until we bed in to these narratives that are our shared collective narratives around materials, around processes, until we face the centre of that grief and begin to understand that that is what connects us to one another, that's what connects us to our ancient stories, the old stories, that's what connects us to regeneration, I just don't feel we stand a chance at all with many of the narratives that we're looking at. It's not what the system wants you to look at. You know, it doesn't really want you to concentrate too much on death or where we put those emotions, where we put difficult emotions, how we see that in each other. We find it incredibly difficult to hold the space in another person when they're upset. It's activating, it's arousing, but until we literally sit with that collectively, I'm not sure how we're going to deal with the huge eco-grief that is heading towards us. I've got another thumbs up. So at my mother's natural burial ground, this is the compost heap. And even looking into the micro detail of how they operate a natural burial ground. So flowers, obviously, only natural, no ribbons, nothing is man-made. It all has to be natural, but it also folds into this incredible compost heap. And the original of that image is just over there. And to give you a little bit of a context, those images were all shown at the Walker Art Gallery with 3.6 tonnes of plastic waste. I borrowed them from the UK's, I borrowed the waste from the UK's largest plastic recyclers, which is in Liverpool. And they lent me 9 bales that were placed in the centre of an incredibly ornate Victorian gallery that has just a world-class collection. It was, it was next to Henry Moore's. People were coming in, and when we were installing, they were saying to me, is the work inside? Is it inside that bale? And it was such an amazing, fascinating space for conversations, because then to be able to go, oh, that is the work. Oh, so that's the work. And I would see them circle around the gallery and come back. And it's almost like they'd summed up the courage to then come back and talk to me about, why would I put rubbish in the gallery? You know, what's this about? And the fact that it mirrored the ceiling had this very ornate gold leaf 3x3 square. The piece of work is called Strangers in a Strange Land, because I was very lucky with the residency to basically go and have a look in their archives, go and have a look underneath in the cellar at all the amazing work there. And I happened upon a piece of work called Strangers in a Strange Land, and the resonance just wasn't lost on me at all. I feel like we're frequently strangers in a strange land in terms of our material use. I've got the thumbs up again. Let's keep clicking. Okay. I have got some long quotes, but I really just want us to stick with these for a moment if we can, because I think they're really vital. I am going to read them out, and I know that can sound a bit, but I think it's important with where we're at. So mourning is about dwelling with the loss, and so coming to appreciate what it means, how the world has changed, and how we must ourselves change and renew our relationships if we're to move forward from here. In this context, genuine mourning should open us up into an awareness of our dependence on and relationship with those countless other beings being driven over the edge of extinction. And I really want to underline and emphasize this sentence with you. So genuine mourning should open us into an awareness of our dependence on and relationship with those countless others being driven over the edge of extinction. The reality, however, is that there is no avoiding the necessity of the difficult cultural work of reflection and mourning. This work is not opposed to practical action, rather it's the foundation of any sustainable and informed response. So I am going to reference Verity. I can't see her now. She may have gone out of the room. But she was talking, well, I don't know if she's gone. She was talking about her son, and her son is 14, and how we have this conversation about the environment. And she was saying very clearly, it's not just about the one response or a quick response back. It's this sense of a sustained and informed response. So it's taking on board the ecology of that grief. It's taking on board an understanding of our agency as practitioners, as individuals, as people that use all of this, and thinking about our sustainable and informed responses, even if that includes and should vitally include all of that grief and the emotion that comes with it. I'm going again. Okay. I feel like this talk contains all of the buzzwords, but this is where a lot of my practice has been rooted in the last 4, 5, 6 years. And this is another one of these words that you'll quite often see. I've seen it multiple times on Facebook memes with sort of cloudy forests behind with a few dots and stars in it, that kind of thing. But the root of it is utterly embedded, coming back into the indwelling sense. So Solastarsia, emotional and physical stress caused by environmental change. So coined by the philosopher Albrecht in 2005 from the words solacium or solacium, comfort, solace, relief, and the Greek root algia, pain. It's a homesickness for the home you haven't left, but that is changing before your eyes. So it's really worth considering. It's 2021, we're at COP26. In 2015, the medical journal of The Lancet included this very definition as a contributing concept to the impact of climate change on human health and well-being. So already in 2015, The Lancet is saying, this is real, this is credible, this is rooted in human experience, this is embedded, this is a definite reality. I wanted to give you a little bit of context. So there's some postcards on recycled paper, and please feel free to recycle it once again. It's a Las Vegas sign that I made for Edge Hill University, and basically it's plastered with the word Anthropocene, which has become hugely contentious. Donna Haraway has a lot to say about it. There are many other versions. We've had to turn it off for tonight, but you'll see, if you go to my Vimeo feed, there's a film that should be playing there that is voiced over by Lucy Lippard, and the one that's after that is called Yours in Ecocide. And that talks about all of our different contexts of these terms, these ways in which we're grappling to understand academically, emotionally, situationally, from the plantationist scene to the capitalist scene, the ways in which we're trying to find the words. And they came after this particular term. Basically, it was brought about by Stormer and Crutzen. They produced this particular name, this particular term, which has become a massive meme. And then everybody, in the way as it should be, you know, one person will come, or a set of theorists will come up with an idea, and then everyone goes, hang on, let's just dig into the detail of what we're really trying to say here. Let's just drop back down as the Latin of what is created in terms of that word and look at the best ways to describe ourselves. But these, in the original installation, these signs, so all of the preceding eons, epochs, were all pointing to this Vegas sign. So, okay. So collective experiences of ecological grief may coalesce into a strengthened sense of love and commitment to the places, ecosystems, and species that inspire, nurture, and sustain us. And I really want to emphasize this phrase again. There is much grief work to be done, and much of it will be hard. However, being open to the pain of ecological loss may be what's needed to prevent such losses from occurring in the first place. So we're coming full circle here. So we're coming full circle back into looking at the part that is difficult, uncomfortable, that isn't part of a manufactured process, even though there is a manufactured process in terms of grief now. But it's coming back into what is natural in terms of where we all go to, where we come from. It's coming back into this sense of this resists that. You know, this plastic that we've created that is a wonder substance, truly and utterly and totally beyond our lifespans, well beyond our lifespans. Nuclear waste, you know, nuclear waste, an afterlife of tens of thousands of years, is strongly resisting our ability to actually understand where we sit within the grief work in terms of us being able to do anything about it. The Vegas sign. Okay. More quotes, but you're all strapped in well on these quotes, so I'm happy that we're all doing okay with them. So we need to feel the despair and feel the hope at the same time. And in the middle of that, there is a way forwards. It's not all bad, but it's not all going to be wonderful either. We have to hold the tension between the two. So I was lucky enough to be commissioned with the Festival of Making to work with a plastic mouldings company, which for me is going to the source. I'm so used to working with the waste and what's left behind. Even beginning that dialogue with, with the place where it's all coming from is in equal parts confronting but revolting, but totally necessary. And I'm of the opinion that that's where we all have to go. We all have to go to the difficult conversations. We're not going to answer the problem by just saying, I say this all the time, we're not going to solve the problem by not eating the Kit Kat because of Nestle. We've got to look at the big conversation around it. It's really important if you don't want to eat that Kit Kat, and I totally understand it. But we've got to look at who's influencing policy. We've got to look at the larger mechanisms that are creating the most environmental impact. And we have to get into the uncomfortable nature of those difficult conversations. So working with this plastic mouldings company was really fascinating. I wanted to look at their sprue. These things are called sprues. You get sprue and waste. I don't know if any of you have ever had airfix planes that you've made, but basically a lot of the machines, when they pump out their extruded mouldings, they have all these connections. There are thousands and thousands of tons of sprue being created every single day in every single plastic mouldings company. A certain amount of it can be chipped back into the process, but there are lots of people at commissioned plastic mouldings companies who don't want any reused material in it at all. So even though they may say, you know, there are cars that are starting to say that their dashboards have X percentage, the reality is there's a lot of incredibly useful afterlife in this product. And it is still a product. It's just as important as the main thing that has been extruded. There should be no difference in our psychology around it. On my Vimeo, you just look for my name, there's a film called Revolution, and I've done my best to try and to work with to grapple. I'm trying not to say the lion or the tiger or the dragon, but to work with them. But they're quite obsessed with the fourth industrial revolution when you go into the plastics industry. And they often tend to think that technology is the answer to the problem, even though that is what's created the problem in the first place. So watch the film and have a think about it yourself, and you get a little bit of time afterwards. Okay, so these, every time a plastic welding machine revs up for speed to get it to the right heat and temperature, it's producing these pools of plastic. So just so that it's pushing, when it pushes through from one colour to the next in extrusion moulding, you get these incredibly organic forms that are just being spat out and spewed and deposited. Same thing again to talk about. This is the installation for the Festival of Making. These piles of mountains of material that are extraneous, they're extra to requirement. Right, so another quote that I'm going to read because it's just so important. So each time a story helps me remember what I thought I knew or introduces me to new knowledge, a muscle critical for caring about flourishing gets some aerobic exercise. Such exercise enhances collective thinking and movement in complexity. Each time I trace a tangle and add a few threads that at first seemed whimsical but turned out to be essential to the fabric, I get a bit straighter with staying with the trouble of complex worlding. Complex worlding is the name of the game of living and dying well together. That's where we are. We're in the place of complex worlding. You know, we've got to get better at being in the game of living and dying well together, because quite often there's, quite naturally, if we go back to our conversation about eco-grief, we're still quite often in this space of overwhelm. We're all responsible to and for shaping conditions for multi-species flourishing in the face of terrible histories, sometimes joyful histories too, but we're not all responsible in the same ways. And that's why I'm coming back into these conversations with some of the really big players, and why it's so vitally important that we do talk to them and we do tackle what seems awkward or difficult or non-approachable. We've got to start to think about ways in which, you know, there are multiple ways in which it is happening, but you know, we are all responsible, but we're all not all responsible in the same ways. Is that my last slide, Tom? Amazing. So how are we doing on time? I want to open it up to any questions, because I think, for a moment, I would love to open the dialogue out, if that's okay. So are we all good at that point? Okay. Tom, do you require people to have the microphone if they're going to ask a question? Does someone want to be my mic? Amazing. Who would like to give the microphone out to people if I pass it? I'm not saying you have to ask me the first question. Okay. I'm just going to pick up. Does anyone have any questions? Or let me just talk through this thing. Is that one's not on? Oh, go on. Okay. So I know I've thrown a lot of definitions, a lot of context at you. It was vitally important for me because on coming into this room, you could quite easily think, oh, these are a load of new objects that have been created for COP. They're not. They all pre-existed. They've all been shown multiple times in different contexts. You know, the neon sign's been shown like 3-4 times in different ways. But I really wanted to bring them all together today and for this exhibition. So, does anyone have any questions? Or comments, or thoughts, or responses about where you feel you're at? Yeah.
That was really fascinating. Thank you, first of all. And I was just wondering, what would you say is, and you may not have an answer to this, but it's just, I'm fascinated because you've been thinking about this topic, obviously, for a long time and in very deep way. But I was just wondering, like, if there's a conversation that you remember that was a particularly powerful conversation, or like, is there somebody that you've met recently or not recently that has been very kind of transformative in the way you've thought, or just something like that that might sort of offer another angle to this?
Yeah, well, there are some people that are in the front here who I think are going to know exactly who I'm talking about when I say this. And there may be some other people when I say this too. And I'm going to get very enthusiastic about someone that was pointed out to me when I was 18, 19. So my foundation art tutor basically sent us, as is often a very informative time, isn't it, when we do if you go and do a foundation art course. She, alongside all the things from Art Forum and Frieze and et cetera, she included an article from Resurgence magazine. And it just, you know, I can feel a hair going off in the back of my neck now. It literally just sort of cracked open my world. Because up until that point, I had, of course I'd had an interest in spiritual things, spiritual dimensions. You know, my brother-in-law would be very derisory if I mentioned anything to say about a crystal, right? Because I was in most formative stages of my life. And then I encountered Satish Kumar. Mm-hmm. So at 19, to cut a long story short with you, originally I went to Nottingham. This is really ironic what I'm about to say to the people that are here, because you're going to know who I'm talking about, and I've never connected this up. Originally I went to Nottingham. I can't believe how life intersects and changes, and actually did 3 months on Shelley Sachs' course in Nottingham, but had no idea about all of it at that point. It didn't sit right for me at the time, and it just wasn't the right time in my life. And I came away, I look back now and I think, the lines we take are incredible, but I didn't complete that course. I came away. And I thought, right, what am I going to do with my life? Where am I going? And I went back to that article from Satish Kumar. And I wrote to him at the small school in Devon, because the small school was still in existence at that point. I wrote to him at Resurgence magazine, and I wrote to him at Schumacher College. And I just said, Satish, I'm so fascinated by what you do, by your model of how you touch the earth, by your practice. Basically, for anyone that isn't aware around Satish and some of his story, I'm going to give you a very, very quick, definitely just pencil drawing. So Satish was a Jain monk, and he knew a man called Vinoba, and Vinoba was one of Gandhi's peers. And he was really, really keen, even though it meant a tremendous amount to become an outcast in India at the time and to leave his family. He spent time with Vinoba, and he talked to Vinoba about what he was seeing in terms of the nuclear proliferation in the world. And he made a decision that he wanted to carry packets of peace tea around the world with nothing but the clothes on his back. And Vinoba had basically said to him, you know, it's the phrase that we're familiar with, the Gandhian phrase, it's that you must be the change you want to see in the world. And by meeting Satish and getting in contact with him and seeing somebody who was walking the talk, quite literally walking the talk, because he took packets of peace trees to the nuclear nations of the world, it totally cracks open my world in such a way that I thought, okay, right, let's come in a little bit more to that embedded sense of how we impact the world, but where the world impacts us, and all of those fascinating conversations in the middle around it. So then I went to Devon, and then that's 25 plus years ago, and I've had interactions and worked with Satish and have taken courses at Schumacher College, which is often, it's coming more in now, I feel, and of course there are fascinating permaculture, ecological, but there was, at that time, it was very much different silos. I'm not saying people weren't doing things in the 40s, 50s, 60s, but I'm talking about collective consciousness. It was very much, it was more separate silos. Whereas now, what I'm loving about, and especially when we talk about Donna Haraway and this game of living and dying well together, human permaculture, the way in which our spaces are being activated with installations, emergent spaces, like the way in which the pipe factory is being used now, it just digs into this sense of human permaculture, and that's where it all, that's where the spark was fully lit. So yeah, I owe a lot to Satish, really. I have a picture of him. I keep a picture of him on my wall because it was one of the magazine's anniversaries. But I always think about his action and travelling around the world with nothing but the clothes on his back. And I think if Satish can do that, do you know what? We can get our boiler suit on and get on with our artworks that are so necessary for living and dying every day. We have to just keep doing it, Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Apologies, I came halfway through your talk. I'm really
That's
sorry.
okay.
But I was wondering, so recently I found out about this role, this community role called a grief doula.
Yeah.
Has it been mentioned? No.
We were having conversations about grief doulas.
So the last few days I've been thinking about this role, but from an ecological perspective. And I wonder if that's going to be something that will be necessary in our communities. That I know in certain communities they have like a mental health first aider.
Yeah.
It's not just a first aider for physical, but for like trauma and support in certain places around the country. And I just wonder whether this is something you've thought about, but this idea that dealing with ecological grief, whether there's like a person that could become the key worker, or like how could we integrate that support, whether it's like having a school counsellor, but how would we identify those people that would support the greater community with that kind of grief that ecological grief might begin to require.
It's a really vital point, massively vital point. And my partner and I were talking about grief doulas literally this week. We've been talking quite a lot about it, and then we've had conversations. There's a fascinating lady here wearing a pink mask, but I won't bring this to you if you don't want to talk. But from the birth perspective, because you've got a tremendous amount of experience from a birth perspective, and we were talking about grief, weren't we? I think it's absolutely vital. I think the only way for us, and I keep coming back into that sentence, and I've got to say again, complex worlding is the name of the game of living and dying well together. How we haven't always, and no, I mean we have, let's not discount the phenomenal place in which death and dying at one point was situated in our culture, but often with very heavy religious bias and therefore lots of shame or guilt around it. I think for us to be flexing our muscles in terms of understanding that feeling, it's vital. I don't understand why every high school in the country, every university doesn't have a grief counsellor and doesn't have, let me correct that because I want to get it very specific, doesn't have a climate doula. I don't know why we don't have an eco-grief doula in every single institution. It should almost be built into the framework of our businesses.
I might take that to my primary school tomorrow.
Well, I think it's vital. I think from that narrative of seed bombs, seriously, honestly, because imagine like how many children in your school, whether you've got 10 or you've got 500, imagine them becoming, that sense of knowledge transfer. Imagine them becoming enlightened, switched on. My Satish Kumar moment. Imagine them at 7, 8, 9 going back and having those conversations with their family units about how we bring that into our collective consciousness. Because until we start to do that, until we're able to hold the space and hold the discomfort, it's in holding the discomfort and the pain and the trauma of those experiences, those realities, that we start to truly understand what connects us. You know, because we're all headed there, and personally, you know, the planet is headed there. In, you know, we talk about code red. We're on, you know, we're on AAA code red. We're headed there, so we have to go into those spaces. So yeah, brilliant question.
Can I come back?
Of course you can.
I don't want to take up space, but
No, take up space.
I just what you said just made me think, because in a way of the metaphor of like human death, we've been disassociated with it because it's so medicalised, it's behind closed doors. And my worry is that a lot of ecological disasters will be behind closed doors. They'll be to do with industry and distance. We might not see it immediately. I mean, obviously, we are beginning to see ecological disaster at greater speed. But I wonder also, how do we like branch that and straddle that? Because I know that grief dealers have to really work hard at making death part of life, and for a lot of people it's distant. A lot of people haven't seen people die, and how do you? I just wondered, like, yeah, there's that sort of thing of like, how do you bring ecological close to home without it being traumatic, and that straddle?
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it? That synthesis, that symbiosis that you just talked of. Then, how do we go into the centre of the grief without it being overwhelming?
Yeah,
We'd have to know that we can go into the centre of the grief and it be overwhelming, and we'll be okay. But we don't know that we'll be okay in the centre of the grief because it's overwhelming. Yeah. And that's why we need these gifted practitioners and death doulas and people that will talk about it publicly, and ways in which we can go, you know, I can remember someone talking about tears and emotion, and there's been lots of practitioners that have looked at this. But it's like you're losing something, or there's a loss if you show emotion, you know, or people will go, that will pass quickly, or don't worry, that'll be over soon. You know, our death stories are the stories that become our birth stories. They aren't over soon. You know, people would always say, especially about my mother, and so in the space of 10 years, I had my mother, my father, my nephew, and 2 close friends, right? And that's when I suddenly started to realise, and this is what's fascinating. I feel like I'm putting my feet down on the ground now, because from the birth perspective, because I honestly feel like death has just started to give me this doorway. So much death came in the space of 10 years that I thought, do you know something? That death is exactly the same as that plastics that's surrounding me. It's exactly the same as this in terms of permanence. We're saturated in it. So in the middle of that context, you know, Tippett once said, and I've been quoting this, I think, since I was about 17, but I would know my shadow and I would know my light, therefore I shall at last be whole. And I come from, on my mother's line, I come from Orthodox Eastern European Jewish stock, and all of that Holocaust narrative and all of the shame around that. And I've made films about that context and that space. And I think when that, you know, the intergenerational grief side of it, and we're going to be getting that in a planetary way, and I totally know that from that Jewish perspective. I feel somewhat saturated in it, even though I'm not practicing. I think until we start to understand that marriage of the two is so important, but it's not going to feed a shareholder in terms of its profit, you know. And I know it has to be commodified, some of the process. You know, some of the training will have to be commodified around it. I get that. I understand that. But, I hope that helps. And I really hope you take that to school next week. I think it would be amazing. And I'd love to work with you on it if you've got time. I don't know how we're doing on time. I'm going to check. Let's have a look. All right, well, look, we're almost like bang on time. I've got 8 minutes. So I feel like I've thrown a lot at you in a short space of time, especially as we're talking about grief and death. Any other comments or thoughts, or just feelings or responses?
Just from a plastic point of view, I haven't really taken it on board, or your work, which is amazing, but just that the woman, that the midwife who brought babies into the world, this is way back when, was also the woman who laid out the dead bodies. So it was almost like the same person did that job. And I don't know why I'm saying that, but that's something that, you know, it connected up, but it was almost like a dirty job. It was almost like a job that nobody else wanted to do because it was so real. That was the thing. So there was this often a very strong woman who would do it, the midwives, the witches that were burnt and all of that. But they would give the job of bringing the babies into the world to the same person, you know, to lay the bodies out. And I don't know, there's something of that in what you're talking about.
I can't thank you enough for your contribution when you share it in that way, because isn't that a gift to the world that the person that would bring new life into the world would also be the one that was clean and lay the bodies out in the same way? And within that context, and it might seem like a stretch, but this is why I put the 3.6 tons of plastic waste into the gallery. You know, one of the finest collections in Europe of the most incredible artworks, because I'm quite literally and physically saying to them within the gallery and within the context of people coming to view, and it's not a new trope. You know, Carl Andre has put bricks into a gallery, you know, found objects, when we shift the context. That's not new. I'm not saying that is new, but what I am saying is, until we connect up our value streams and where we place value, and until we look at what lasts and what's lasting, we're going to be on this strange trajectory where we're going to continue with code double red or triple red. So I feel it's the tying together. You know, when we talk about each time I trace a tangle and add a few threads, I often think that the best I hope to do, with my fingers crossed with this work is, and with all of my work, and since meeting Satish, and, well, obviously Satish is doing it because he's done it for me and millions of other people, is add a few threads. We have to keep adding the threads back in to close the narrative. Yeah. And we have to keep adding it back in to become a closed loop. You know, open loop processes, plastic manufacturing is largely open loop. Many of our life narratives that we share, or the processes where we're not enough, where we don't feel like we're enough, we've got to buy more, our phones, we've got to have a new phone every year. Wow, you know, when we dig into where that feeling of belonging into each other and our value systems, it's astonishing what that's actually, where we're focusing. And it's we haven't got the time now, but in terms of our neuroreceptors and how stimulated we get by feeling that we're not enough, by shame, you know, there's so much work to do around shame and the planet. I really, if there wasn't, there's a band I think called Shame Club, but I really wanted to set up Shame Club, but someone's already got it, because I just think that's, you know, there's so much stuff around shame. We're not doing enough. We're not enough. When we're not enough, we purchase more, we drink more, we gamble more. You know, we're probably not as receptive as we could be to each other. All these processes, they're fascinating, because if you go into that space of shame, it's only the moment where we feel disembodied from ourselves and the planet and the earth that's surrounding us. You know, so it's incredibly powerful. And incredibly important, the work in those spaces. But yeah, to me, if we can all be adding a few threads to that narrative, it becomes essential to the fabric and brings it back in on the closed loop. Yeah. I think there's another question at the back.
I was sorry, I should for the online people. I'm sorry I arrived late, but I was going to ask where hope and homeostasis and optimism might lie, because I have a great sense of optimism and hope, even though it says last. And when I'm viewing your work, it carries with it something that it has a connection to more than grief.
There's a lot I could say about that. There is a lot I could say about it. And I think if I'm really honest with you, and it's a lot of that mortality in a short space of time as well. It's when we have a perception of what we think life might be like, and then life does what it is going to do naturally and offers you your story, which isn't necessarily you're going to be this and you're going to live there and it's going to be like this. When life starts talking to you with its own narrative, and you dig into that, and that comes out of these grief conversations and losing a lot of people in a short space of time. And you know, I totally hold my hands up, because I'm not on the edge of a tsunami, so I haven't lost my whole community. So as I say it to you, I'm digging in from the Mustakis point of view again of the indwelling of someone that's talking about familial and friendship-based growth. But I don't want to swear on here, but you know, let's just dig in a minute to being next to that oil spill. Let's just dig in a minute to that tsunami where you've lost 20,000 people around you. I totally understand when we talk about hope, but I suppose, to be quite frank, a lot of me is focused. And I don't know, maybe it's in my delivery. I've just put my fingers crossed again. Maybe it's in my delivery. Maybe that's where the hope is. And it's the conversations about, I wonder if we can have a death doula. I wonder if we can do it in our primary school. Maybe that's where the hope is. It's in the weave of the fabric, and it's in our interconnections. But I'm totally convinced. And, you know, I didn't talk to you about the detail on these, but I do want to underline it. These were produced for an event in Birmingham called Quiet Carnival with Friction Arts. And it was one of the, when we came out of that first lockdown, basically it was a socially distanced, repeated carnival that went on at Friction Arts. And I just couldn't get past all of those briefing things we were told by the government. And, you know, this is where, so maybe I sometimes use hope in a, not an ironic way, but maybe I'm sort of, you know, playing with it a little bit. It's all that stuff around tricksters and trickster, maybe it's that trickster methodology. But, you know, when I kept hearing all of these governmental statements, all these banners contain exact wording from the UK governmental statements that were released every single day. Our next steps will be sure-footed and sustainable. You know, I completely and utterly understand the world has faced a COVID crisis. Of course I understand, because it was very threatening for our financial, our physical, our social structures. Of course I understand it had to galvanise in the way it was and is. But I mean, I am so totally appalled when I read and hear a governmental statement saying our next steps will be sure-footed and sustainable, and it isn't talking about the planet. You know, I just think the might, the will, the strategizing that could actually be put towards doing something about what is actually happening in our triple code red, we're not there. We're not there. I know we've got COP. I know people are here from all over the world, and I know we've got fascinating emergent moments like this where we can have these dialogues, but I just don't feel we're there. So, yeah, maybe I'm using hope like a trickster would. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, no,
I'll tell
thanks.
you what it is,
but
Simon.
I mean, hope is maybe a harder word to grasp. But I also asked about optimism and homeostasis as the flip side of shame.
Okay, so there's let's just try and remember his name. There's a fascinating counsellor called and doctor called Chris Johnston, and I took a course with him at Schumacher on resilience, right? So he talks about finding your edge. So going to the edge of what is difficult or uncomfortable for you, and that's where your work is. And that's where my optimism is. And it doesn't always mean it's an easy space, and it doesn't always mean the conversations are easy, but it's that maybe that's my optimism is in, again saying it, but it's redrawing those threads together at those, because that's what I can do. You know, putting the art boiler suit on, that's what I'm doing today. And it's in, if I am going to bring an object to the conversation, which I won't always do because you've seen from the previous work, mostly I deal with waste, and it's something that, it's the waste that I can recycle. But if I'm actually going to use resources to bring a virgin product to the conversation within the narrative around art and objects and value, I've got to be able to reuse that as a regenerative tool. So this has got to keep coming back in and out and in and out and in and out, and we've got to keep having the conversation. So maybe the optimism is in the objects and in the conversations that come from it. This is where my optimism is. I'm going to do a time check. 4:01. It's been a dense hour. I hope I answered.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks, yeah.
Any last comments? The show comes down tonight, so you've come in just in the nick of time, but it has been documented on my website. And there are some cards available if you want to carry any conversations on. I'm more than happy. So are we all good? So thank you.